As with most European discoveries, James Cook would find his most famous discovery by a sheer stroke of luck. The legendary British explorer on his third Pacific voyage was bound for the Nootka Sound in modern Canada in search of the elusive Northwest Passage. Instead of the mythical passage, he would find instead the land of myth and legend, the archipelago of Hawaii. First spotting Kauai, he and his crew would have to return as the window for northern exploration in Canada was slim and they couldn't spare a moment. But once the northern passes closed of ice, they would return and spot first the Isle of Maui and slowly made their way towards the big island of Hawaii. Here, they would find Kealakekua Bay, or as it's known in Hawaiian, the Path of God. It would seem that the divine did play their part on this day at the end of January of 1779. By an insane twist of historical fate, Cook and his crew would land in Kealakekua Bay during the Makahiki ritual cycle, a particularly auspicious time of the year for the Native Hawaiians. The cycle, running from October to February, sees the return of the god Lono, who traditionally visits all parts of the Big Island in a clockwise fashion to collect tribute. Lono, the god of peace and fertility, is represented during this tour of tribute by a long pole with a cross piece of wood draped with a white cloth over it. Cook, by sheer chance, would sail around the island in a clockwise fashion, carrying a big white cloth on a crossed pole, also known as the mast of his ship, and he would arrive at Kealakekua Bay, or the Path of God, sacred to Lono. The Native Hawaiians, seeing this, believe Cook to be, as historian Christina Thompson noted, seen as a living embodiment of their god, arriving exactly when and how Lono was expected to return. The man who had been all over the Pacific, more than any European at this time, was met with a peculiar sight. A fleet of 1,000 canoes approached Cook's ship like shoals of fish, in his own words, and welcomed Cook and his crew to shore. Once on the sand, hundreds of spectators prostrated themselves, and Cook was led up to a stone dais and cloaked in a red cloth and offered a cooked pig. Orono, Orono, the natives would chant, growing louder and repeating over the afternoon. Cook had no idea what the word meant or why hundreds of people were shouting it at him. This experienced explorer who had navigated the strange and unfamiliar across all the Pacific suddenly found himself in a situation he couldn't read, being worshipped for reasons completely beyond his understanding. Cook and his crew would stay for 2 weeks before raising anchor and leaving the bay, but their luck would soon run out. The mast of their ship would split in a strong storm, and they would be forced to return to the bay to make repairs. A mistake. What the foreigners did not know was that the god Lono was supposed to leave at the end of the Makahiki cycle and not come back until next year. Cook's return could not be explained, and the then chief at Kealakekua Bay decided that Cook and his crew had both lied and played tricks on them. They would not be met with the same fanfare as the first time around. Cook had won his fame, sailing all over the world and famously the Pacific, into many places that were both completely uncharted and just outright dangerous. He had faced countless perils before, but with the mood so tense between the natives and the crew, a word became a push became a brawl, and a brawl turned into a loud pop And just like that, Captain James Cook was dead. The Pacific Ocean is not just the largest ocean. It is the Earth's largest single feature. 12,000 miles wide and 10,000 miles tall, it is an incomprehensible vastness of 63 million square miles. The 20 to 25,000 islands speckling this expanse range from the alpine peaks of New Zealand to the dense jungles of the Solomon Islands to the lush volcanic high islands of Hawaii. Despite the seemingly endless options for exploring, early European navigators were by and large funneled to the same sea lanes by both the currents and winds that dominate the Pacific. Two massive circles of air called gyres controlled the weather, one in the northern hemisphere, the other in the southern hemisphere. In 1513, the Spanish conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and spotted what he would call the Mar del Sur, or the Southern Ocean. From there, it would take European explorers over 200 years to find Hawaii, an archipelago perfectly situated between the two gyres. For 2 centuries, European explorers left a legacy of finding nothing but seemingly endless expanses of empty water. Magellan would sail for months, seemingly missing everything between Chile and the Philippines, crossing thousands of miles without spotting a single island. Cook himself would sail for weeks at a time with nothing on the horizon but the waves. The distances were staggering. Often thousands of miles of open ocean separated island chains that left captains with no reference points and little hope. To European eyes, the Pacific appeared to be an almost impossibly hostile void, broken only by the occasional miracle of land. But you can't discover places where people already live, and the Pacific was anything but empty. This seemingly barren vastness that appeared empty to European eyes was completely colonized by the Polynesians. Every speck of land big enough to settle was both found and settled, much to the amazement of the Europeans, who often remarked that every spit of land was crowded with humanity. The only thing more remarkable than the Polynesians finding all those thousands of islands in a 63 million square mile area is the way they found them. The way in which they even sailed was a mystery to Western scholars all the way until modern times. By the time Cook and other European explorers had begun to explore the Pacific, they encountered a people who were the daughter cultures of the great Polynesian sailors whose golden era ended centuries before Vasco Núñez de Balboa spotted the Pacific. The great European navigators who struggled mightily against the vastness of this ocean did not hold a candle to their Polynesian predecessors. Western scholars had debated whether the Polynesian feats were even possible, let alone how they actually navigated this vast ocean without instruments. The techniques seemed lost to time until 1968, when a British physician and passionate blue water sailor named David Lewis decided he simply wasn't content with just theories. He was going to find the last living masters and learn their secrets firsthand. Lewis was a doctor who had left his practice in 1964 to sail the world, which would eventually lead him to solo cross the Atlantic not once, but 3 times. Skill was not his issue, but knowledge was. The The golden age of Polynesian sail was long gone, and the knowledge that remained of the old ways was sparse at best. Undeterred by this, Lewis set out across the Pacific to find this information, describing it as a, quote, mosaic of fragments only waiting to be put together, end quote. The first navigator he met was a man from Melanesia named Tevake, a wrinkly old man well past his prime, but in his heyday, he would sail 320 plus miles of open ocean in nothing but an outrigger canoe. Lewis would describe himself as a pupil amongst these masters, and Tevake had plenty to teach. The Polynesians famously navigated with stars, and we'll get into that, I promise, but travel via stars only works at night. During the day, they needed a different technique, and that was reading ocean swells. Swells are not waves. Waves are local, caused by the wind, but swells are waves that were created far away, whose momentum carried them past the wind that generated them. An astute navigator can not so much see the swells, but feel them as they rock their canoe. The larger swells are created by the large weather patterns in the Pacific, such as the gyres mentioned earlier and other large wind phenomena. Through this, a seasoned navigator could feel out their location. Easier said than done. For every swell, there was a cacophony of local waves that muddled the signal, and even an experienced sailor like Lewis could not consistently pick out the swells without having them pointed out. Oftentimes, Tevake would lie down on the outrigger platform of his canoe to clear the signal a bit and disentangle the mess. Tevake showed Lewis how what he called the sea swell and the long swell interlocked, and based on where they hit the canoe, how the vessel pitched, yawed, rose, and fell with the waves, he could navigate from there. One bit of local wisdom that was passed down to Lewis from another veteran was that a man's testicles are particularly sensitive to feeling out the rock of the waves. The next master whom Lewis would study under was Hipour from the Caroline Islands. He would teach Lewis how to navigate via star path. Star paths were imaginary paths created by the navigators, selecting a rising and setting point of a chain of stars. From there, they would follow the stars to the next island. Usually 10 stars would constitute a star path, but as little as 5 could be used. Oftentimes, clouds would obscure their view, but most of these master wayfinders knew the night sky so well they would often only need a star or two to know what they were looking at. Hipour impressed Lewis on their first night sailing together by holding the canoe in a steady path pointing at the Pleiades, a star cluster. Once the clouds obscured their vision of the cluster, Hipour kept the Great Bear constellation on one side to maintain course, all the while using several other star clusters for reference. At one point in the night, Lewis spotted a strange star which seemingly appeared out of nowhere. He asked Hipour about this, to which Hipour grinned and responded in English, "Satellite." Another piece of navigational wisdom that comes from the Caroline Islands is the concept of itak. Out of sight of land and on a relatively small canoe, the features around the navigator can seem frozen. As the anthropologist Thomas Gladwin wrote, quote, "You may travel for days on the
but the stars will not go away or change their positions aside from their nightly trajectories. Hours go by. Miles of water have flowed past, yet the canoe is still underneath.
And the stars still above." End quote. In order to keep track of their progress, navigators will imagine a reference island, which could be a real island, but usually imagined, off to the side of their path, about midway to the destination. As they journey along, the reference island moves to each star in the star path, and the canoe seemingly stays still. Clearly, this isn't the case. The canoe is moving, but using this method, a navigator can now tell the distance covered, the speed of travel, and the bearings of the stars relative to the canoe. Through the attacks, or segments, the navigator now has a useful mental map. Lewis would learn from other masters that birds are a navigator's best friend. Knowing the type of bird meant knowing that a booby meant you were 50 miles away, while the land-based terns and noddies meant that you were at most 10 miles away from land. Going back to our old friend Hipour, his love of birds pours through when he tells Lewis, quote, "A booby which comes upon a sailing canoe will turn and start circling over it. He acts as though he wants to land on it, but he does not. At last, when the sky is almost dark, he finally, perhaps reluctantly, leaves the canoe and heads straight for home." End quote. But honestly, the most fascinating part, to me at least, is the clouds. Clouds are my little fluffy treats in the sky. From the neck-stretching cumulonimbus to the ethereal cirrus clouds, clouds totally enrapture me, especially after trying acid. Floating on a rooftop pool in Miami while staring up at the fractally goofballs really branded them on my heart for the rest of days. The Polynesians had a similar, albeit different reason for loving the clouds. Clouds will move slowly over land and speed up once past it. Clouds will form long V formations which point to land. Clouds are brighter over land than over the ocean. Clouds have a kiss of pink over land or a reef and a green glow when over a lagoon. Lewis himself approached Tarawa with a Gilbertese navigator named Ayotaibata. As he approached the atoll, famous for the vicious battle that took place there in World War II, he spotted an intense green glow off the bottom of the cloud. Surprised his navigator didn't point this out, Lewis later asked his navigator about this, to which Ayotaibata replied, quote, "I did not wish to embarrass you or insult you by mentioning the green. Even the Europeans noticed the obvious sign." End quote. With all these tools, the language of swells, the star paths, the flights of birds and clouds, the Polynesians had everything they needed to find even the most remote specks of land in the Pacific's vastness. And eventually, using these same techniques that Lewis would learn centuries later, they would discover one of the ocean's greatest prizes. The Polynesians who would go on to master the Pacific would eventually find the Hawaiian archipelago, a mesmerizing chain of islands straddled by high mountain walls, lush rainforests, and enshrouded in a mystical beauty. Pinpointing exactly when the Polynesians first settled Hawaii sent me down a 3 a.m. research rabbit hole, and honestly, the answer I came away with is, we aren't sure. But what we are sure of is that they did arrive, and the great masters of the ocean created myths to explain the enigmatic land they found. Here we introduce Pele Hanua Mea, or she who shapes the sacred land, or as she's most commonly known by, Pele. A fiery goddess in both power and in temperament, she was banished by her father from her homeland of Kahiki for her temper and for seducing her sister's husband. In her flight across the Pacific and in search of a new home, she would clash with her sister, Namakaokahai, eager to get back at Pele. Namakaokahai, or Namaka, the goddess of water, would clash with her sister at any given chance. The heavenly battle between the unstoppable force of fire and the immovable forces of water would produce lava, smoke, rock, and eventually, Hawaii. Each island from Niihau to Oahu to the Big Island itself was created from this battle as Pele sought refuge from the overwhelming force of her sister Namaka. Her last place of refuge, where she resides to this very day, is the Halemaumau crater at the summit of Kilauea on the Big Island of Hawaii. Here, she shares the towering snow-capped volcanic island as a home with 4 other deities. Today, Pele is still very much a part of Hawaii. The locals leave offerings for her such as fruit or pickings from her sacred plant, the ohelo plant, to welcome good fortune into their lives. Her home, the volcano Kilauea, has been continuously active since 1900, erupting in some fashion for 93 out of the 125 years since then, a loud and fiery reminder of her presence. But Pele's story tells us something deeper about these master navigators. They didn't just find islands, they found meaning in them. The same people who could read stars, waves, birds, and clouds could look at an active volcano and create a mythology that explained not just how the land was formed, but why they belonged there. Kahiki itself, Pele's homeland, is the Hawaiian word for Tahiti, showing how the archipelago fits in the wider universe of the Polynesian triangle. In exploring the Pacific, the Polynesians not only found countless islands, they found themselves.